Pleasure to be here and to start the session. Not just for children, which is not quite the title I see in the programme. It says something posher than that. PID is not just a paediatric issue, but it is something that I feel very strongly about, having looked after adults and children throughout my working life. So I will give you a short historical account of why I think that this explains why so many people think immunodeficiencies are a problem of children. And certainly when I started in Oxford, I was told they wouldn't. I was an adult physician. Why wasn't I in paediatrics? So it's been a gradual understanding, primary immunodeficiency, based on scientific discoveries, the early first descriptions in the 50s and 60s, and then understanding antibody deficiencies, largely of late onset, because people had been looking at the lymphoid malignancies, and here were antibody deficiencies without lymphoid malignancies. Then we come into the realm of genes, the X-linked ones first, because family history gave us such a good clue, and now, since the whole genome project, beginning to understand other ways in which genes can be effective or ineffective. But let's just go back a moment, several decades. Infection rates. I'll do this one. And then those people won't be able to see. You'll just have to look at it. Infection rates per 10 in the United Kingdom, collected in the last century and a bit before. Hygiene made the biggest difference. Antibiotics made a further difference. And then, of course, we began to see patients who were having recurrent infections. We didn't see them before antibiotics came along because they didn't survive. And then there were immunizations and immunization failures. And so the diseases that we look after are pretty new. First described in 1956, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the MRC series in 1969. It may seem that many of you weren't even born then, but this is roughly the time that I was at school or at medical school, and so it's interesting to look at the PID timelines over the last several decades. 1956, Bruton described A gamma-globulinemia. Then we discovered in the 70s about T and B cells and began to understand this description from the Swiss of A gamma patients who had very severe and often fatal infections, and we began to realize that they were missing the cell-mediated and the humoral sides of their immune systems. In the 90s, the X-linked genes were found, first ones to be discovered in our field, and now in the 2000s, family studies, the new genome sequencing, the new exome sequencing and so on, has led to genes being found for particular susceptibilities, and more importantly, the way that gene products can interact, and, dare I say it, oligogenic diseases. And in the yet to come, coming quite fast now, the dysregulation and autoimmunity linking with immunodeficiencies. So I'm going to talk about, I've been asked to do the history, so that's what I'm going to do, the basic scientific discoveries, talk about some particular influences, the World Health Organization Committee, the MRC report, and the genes for X-linked diseases, then the discovery of immune receptors and mechanisms by which immunity works. I've mentioned the genome project and the family studies. So if we look at blood, as discovered in 1628, and then the microscope working out that blood had cells as well as plasma, it was then 200 years before the precursors of the different bloodlines were discovered. And how does this fit in with immunity? Well, having got plasma, we knew that there were proteins in the plasma. And it was by passing an electric current through a gel containing patient serum. There's an echo here. Can you hear me all right? All right, good. A gel containing some anticoagulated plasma, we have electrophoresis. originally set up to diagnose lymphoid malignancies. And this is how it looked. So, on the left, well, this is, I think, is meant to be the pointer. Oh, it's very faint. On that side, your left, you can see a protein staining of an electrophoresis of serum, that's de-anticoagulated plasma. And the big band is albumin, because almost half our blood contains albumin, very important for keeping it isotonic. And then the protein regions are divided into three: the alpha proteins, the beta proteins, and the gamma proteins. The alpha and beta form nice discrete lines where the individual proteins come, if there's enough of them. And there's a big splurge where the gamma proteins are. You're looking, in fact, at a patient who has an IgA monoclonal band. Probably didn't do the patient too much harm. In the second from the left, you can see where the strip has been stained with an anti-IgG antibody, and you can see there's a smear of IgG, and that's what our electrophoresis would look like too. And in the 1940s, late 40s and 50s, the plasma could be separated using this knowledge on an industrial scale by Cohn and others, and purified into what was then called gamma globulin, subsequently called immunoglobulin, immune proteins, and used intramuscularly or subcutaneously. And this is what Bruton used in a child who had too many infections, had nothing where that smear ought to be, and the recurrent infections were reduced as a result of the preparation being given, in fact, subcutaneously, as it turns out, to this child. And then in the 60s, it became clear that it wasn't just children. So this is the first time that people realized that, this can happen in grown-ups. This can happen in adults who don't have lymphoid malignancies, but do have missing gamma proteins, and they have too many infections, a condition we are tempted to call common variable immunodeficiency disorders these days. What about the connection between the gamma globulins and infections? This BMJ article from 1953 uses that gamma globulins product as protection against polio. There was no immunization then. This one uses it as protection against what then was known as infectious hepatitis. And here is a very early report from 1964 from the west coast of the States on recurrent infections and children who don't have any of this immunoglobulin or this IgG in their serum. And I've enlarged the bit that is the abstract that says these children, only 6 types, those were the days, have too many bacterial infections, in part due to a lack of synthesis of serum immunoglobulins. They don't have, on electrophoresis and immunophoresis, you cannot see the gamma proteins. This, of course, all relates to children. So all this early work is in children. Here's a bit more from Switzerland, the Swiss A-gammas, 1961. Herzig and his colleague described children who had very severe lack of antibodies and no lymphocytes. And, of course, now we know this is severe combined immune deficiency. We know there are at least 100 essential genes that may be mutated, and next week there may be many more. Children, infants. The discovery of T and B cells in the 1970s in humans, of course, they've been working in animals for some time to get cell-mediated and humoral immunity since the early 50s. But in the 70s, the first marker was found for human T cells. Here they are, lymphocyte preparations with red blobs staining the nuclei and sheep red blood cells mixed in, and the T cells had a special receptor for this sheep red cells, which we now know to be CD2, to form rosettes. This is my doctoral thesis. Counting these cells was no fun. Thank goodness monoclonal antibodies were invented very quickly for particular markers of particular cells. But don't think that immunodeficiency was the motivation for this. This was so that we could detect progressive disease in HIV patients. So that really did help. And then, of course, flow cytometers for precise counting, and we could throw away our hemocytometers. So now, back to the clinicians and the attempt to link T cells or B cell deficiencies with the different types of infections. B cells with the infections with the pyogenic bacteria and the enteroviruses, but not so commonly, and the T cell defects with the intracellular viruses and fungi. And of course, if you're missing both, severe combined. The MRC report was obligatory reading for those of us coming into the immunodeficiency field in 1969. 172 extremely well-characterized cases. It's well worth reading now. You can read a case and know whether it's an XLA or a hyper-IgM just by the detail that's in there. But look at the age distribution. It's mainly children and young adults. In fact, for the boys, 80% of them were under 18. For the girls, it's 50-50. So still, the focus is on immunodeficiency in children. Around this time, the WHO set up their PID committee. It's now an IUIS committee. It was to describe the different types of immune deficiencies. The first report, 1971, subsequently every 2 years. The original committee are there. The interesting thing is that they're all, nearly all, pediatricians. And here's the report. And you probably, if you look very closely down the left-hand side, you can see I've starred those that were in children, which is most of them. But I think the most interesting bit is here, which doesn't enlarge very well, but it says, and then there's a muddled collection of things that is largely unclassified and extremely frequent called variable immunodeficiency. And that's what has currently termed common variable immunodeficiency disorders. Very frequent, much more frequent than all these things that are in children. We've known this for a long time, but it's taken forever for this to come out in the registries very slowly throughout the world. So what about my experience is obviously in the United Kingdom, and we set about in the early 90s, where were the adult patients? By then we had a good set of clinical immunologists and a registry. And we set out to determine where these adult patients were hiding. There's a list of the related specialties in which we could find them. We wrote a consensus document that we asked the specialty groups through the Royal College of Physicians to endorse so that awareness was spread and the patients would be referred to us. We asked the Department of Health to highlight immunodeficiencies in their journal and the consensus document in particular. And did we find them? Suddenly, a massive increase in the registration and more year on year, twice as many, and then 3 times as many in the subsequent years being put in. So we felt this was a very successful way to go, and we found a lot of adults. The importance of registers is to find the missing adults, and I'm going to touch on that a bit more in other countries in a minute, as well as catching the attention of the people who pay us, pay for the treatments, and pay our hospitals so the patients can come and see us in the first place. It enables costs to be calculated more accurately, which the politicians like, and it gives comparisons with other specialty groups that have perhaps got more publicity than our own discipline. These are the figures that I prepared for a talk in Malaysia a few years ago. The publications in this century on the 2 conditions. You can see that those in HIV seriously outweigh those in primary immune deficiency. Has this got any better? Well, I did count up the first 6 months of 2017, and yes, it's getting much better. We're getting some primary immunodeficiency publications in other countries in Southeast Asia, but they're all about children. So a lot of adults are missing still. This is not just about children. Malaysia I was particularly interested in. They've collected together the 4 major hospitals, produced an excellent report. But within this report, 2014, I think, the majority, 80% of the patients collected were under the age of 10, and half of them were in the first 5 years of life. We must get our adult friends and colleagues more interested in this condition. The pediatricians are doing well, but we're not. Does it matter? Yes, the adults are likely to be antibody deficiency patients, and they're going to need therapeutic immunoglobulin. One example from Europe, in Poland, where they set up their working group in 2005 and set the registry. Very successfully, they managed to get the government on board in 2008 through the programs for rare diseases, and they're doing really well. Specialist networks have been formed, but I was in touch with Margalotta this week to see how many had been put in more recently. In 2014, there were 731 new patients put into the register, of whom 655 were children. So it's still a problem looking for adults in countries where they've been doing it for quite a long time. And their report is even more astonishing because it finishes with this paragraph: there is no therapeutic program for adults with primary immunodeficiency, although some hospitals allow them to give subcutaneous immunoglobulin. It doesn't say everyone can get it, it says some hospitals. I first went to Poland 30 years ago. They could give immunoglobulin up to the age of 12. When I went some 20 years later, they could give immunoglobulin up to the age of 23. They can now give it, as you can see, in certain places, but it is not universal. And it's something that IPOPI and I, and all of us, feel very strongly about. I hope you too. Therapeutic immunoglobulin's been on the WHO Essential Medicines list since 2006. That's over a decade. It's on the list for adults and the list for children, thanks to IPOPI and the IPIC committee. It did increase the availability of immunoglobulin, now covers many countries, but it must be for adults too, and subcutaneous is very limited in its availability. And then we just come up to the present time with gene discovery. This I've pinched from Amos Etzioni and Hans Ochs's history of primary immunodeficiencies. The gap between the date of the description of the disease and the date of genetic discovery can be anything from 30 to 50 years. So we're now into the genes phase, and I'm sure you'll hear a lot about that in the next several days. In conclusion, therefore, the underdiagnosis rate, looking at the registries across the world, for infants and children with this condition, or these conditions, is between 40 and 70% worldwide. The underdiagnosis rate for adults is between 50 and 98% worldwide. Most of the adults are going to be antibody failure and therefore treatable. These are patients of working age, so we have to convince our governments that it is not cost-effective to ignore this infection or disease burden. Patients live longer. We now know that late-onset immunodeficiencies can be combined. They're presenting later. And as the genes come out and the markers for T cells and B cells become more sophisticated, it's becoming clearer. But do not let our colleagues in related specialties ignore the adults. Thank you.